That Tuesday afternoon changed everything. I'm sitting here now, months later, and I can still feel the shock of watching someone I trusted completely destroy my career while smiling to my face. Rebecca Martinez walked into Patterson Tech as a nervous new hire, and I became her mentor, believing that helping others succeed was just part of being a good colleague. I had no idea I was training my own replacement. The moment that still haunts me happened in David's office when he said those words. I'll never forget. Rebecca has expressed some concerns about your technical capabilities. My hands started trembling right there in the meeting. I felt sick to my stomach. Here was someone I had personally taught everything she knew about our systems, questioning my competence to our manager using knowledge I had given her as evidence of my own inadequacy. The rage hit me first, then the humiliation, then this crushing realization that I had been played for months. This woman I'd stayed late to help, whose questions I'd answered with patience, who I'd shared my most valuable professional insights with, she had been building a case against me the entire time. I wanted to scream, to shake David, and make him understand what was really happening. But I just sat there feeling like the biggest fool in corporate America. But what came after that meeting? That's when I discovered who I really was underneath all the betrayal and disappointment. And that's a story worth telling. The morning Rebecca walked through those glass doors at Patterson Tech, I had no idea I was looking at my own professional executioner. She wore a nervous smile and clutched the worn leather portfolio, like it was her lifeline. Our manager, David, introduced her as the new systems analyst and asked me to be her mentor. Without hesitation, I said yes, believing that collaboration was the foundation of any successful team. Trust has always been my default setting, and looking at her uncertain face reminded me of my own first day 3 years earlier. I saw myself in her anxious glances and the way she fidgeted with her badge. The irony wasn't lost on me later. I was literally teaching someone to take my place. Those first 7 days were a masterclass in patience that I never knew I was giving. Rebecca didn't even know where we stored the main system files, something so basic that most new hires figured out within hours. But I didn't judge her for it. Instead, I spent my lunch breaks walking her through our network architecture, explaining the intricate connections between our legacy systems and the newer integrations we'd built over the years. She would nod eagerly, taking notes in a small spiral notebook that she carried everywhere. Her handwriting was neat, methodical, and she asked the same questions repeatedly until she understood. I found her dedication refreshing in a world where most people wanted shortcuts. Little did I know she was memorizing every detail of my expertise, cataloging my knowledge like she was planning to steal it. It was during one of those afternoon coffee breaks in the small kitchen near our cubicles, when she said the words that would haunt me later. "I honestly don't know what I'd do without you," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate care. Her voice carried genuine gratitude, and her eyes met mine with what seemed like sincere appreciation. "You're like my anchor in this place. Everyone else seems so busy, but you actually take time to explain things." I felt a warmth spread through my chest, the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing you're making a real difference in someone's life. I thought we were building something meaningful, a mentorship that would grow into a genuine partnership. I believed her words because I wanted to believe that kindness still mattered in corporate America. The late nights started innocently enough. Rebecca would stay behind after everyone else had left, claiming she wanted to practice what I'd taught her during the day. Our office building would grow quiet except for the hum of computers and the occasional sound of the janitor's cart rolling down the hallway. I'd watch her struggle with command sequences that should have been straightforward, making errors that seemed almost deliberate in their simplicity. But I never made her feel stupid about it. Instead, I'd pull up a chair beside her workstation and guide her through each step again, my patience seemingly endless. I'd cover for her mistakes before David noticed, cleaning up her code errors and fixing integration problems she'd created. I told myself I was being a good colleague, that everyone deserved support while they were learning. What I was actually doing was enabling someone who was documenting my every move. The moment that should have been my first red flag came 3 weeks into her employment. I handed over my personal notebook, a leather-bound journal where I'd documented every system quirk, every workaround, and every solution I'd discovered during my 3 years at Patterson Tech. It contained years of accumulated wisdom, the kind of institutional knowledge that companies lose when experienced employees leave. The processes I'd refined, the shortcuts I'd discovered, the integration fixes I'd developed. It was all there, written in my own handwriting like a technical diary. When I placed it in her hands, she held it like it was made of gold. "This is incredible," she whispered, flipping through pages of my meticulous notes. "This is like having a roadmap to everything." I smiled, pleased that my hard work could help someone else succeed. I had no idea I was handing over the keys to my own replacement. Those early weeks were filled with what I interpreted as gratitude and friendship. Rebecca would bring me coffee in the mornings, the exact way I liked it, black with just a touch of cream. She'd ask about my weekend plans and share stories about her own life, creating an illusion of camaraderie that felt genuine. When she struggled with particularly complex tasks, she'd look at me with those wide, grateful eyes and say things like, "You make this look so easy," or, "I hope I can be half as good as you someday." Her words felt like validation for all the extra hours I was putting in, all the patience I was showing. I genuinely believed I was watching someone grow under my guidance, that I was making a positive impact on her career trajectory. The truth was far more calculating than I could have imagined at the time. But even in those early days, there were moments that didn't quite add up, though I dismissed them as quirks of personality or nervousness. Sometimes she'd ask me to repeat explanations she'd written down just days before, as if she'd forgotten everything I'd taught her. Other times, I'd catch her watching me work with an intensity that seemed more analytical than educational. She'd study my keystrokes, my workflow, the way I navigated between systems, with the focus of someone creating a detailed map rather than someone trying to learn. When I'd ask if she was following along, she'd quickly nod and flash that nervous smile. That something in her expression would shift so quickly, I'd question whether I'd seen it at all. These were the subtle signs that my instincts tried to warn me about, but my desire to be helpful and my natural inclination to trust overrode those whispers of doubt. I was so focused on being the mentor. I wished I'd had that I missed all the signs that Rebecca was studying me like a predator studies its prey. Time has a way of revealing people's true nature, and with Rebecca, that revelation came in small, almost imperceptible shifts that I initially attributed to growing confidence. The questions that had once flowed freely began to dry up, but instead of the comfortable silence of understanding, there was something else, a distance that felt deliberately constructed. She'd still smile when she saw me in the morning, still say hello when we passed in the hallway, but there was a coolness behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was like watching someone slowly close a door that had once been wide open. The warmth that had characterized our early interactions was being replaced by something more calculated, more professional in the worst possible way. I found myself studying her expressions, trying to pinpoint exactly when things had changed, but the shift had been so gradual that I couldn't identify a specific moment, when my trusted mentee had begun to see me as competition rather than guidance. The first real crack in our relationship happened during a quiet moment in the supply closet, where we kept extra printer paper and office supplies. I was grabbing a new stack of legal pads when Rebecca appeared beside me, seemingly out of nowhere. "You know, you're absolutely brilliant at what you do," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, glancing toward the door as if someone might overhear us. Her words should have felt like a compliment, but there was something furtive about the way she delivered them, like she was sharing a secret she didn't want anyone else to know. When I thanked her and started to elaborate on some of the techniques I'd learned over the years, she quickly changed the subject and headed back to her desk. It struck me as odd that she would praise my abilities in private, but never acknowledge them when others were around. Later, during our team meeting that same afternoon, when David asked for input on a particularly challenging integration problem, Rebecca remained silent even though I'd just explained the exact solution to her 20 minutes earlier. The stealing started so subtly that I almost missed it entirely. During a presentation to our regional manager about system improvements, I listened in growing disbelief as Rebecca described a data integration solution that I had developed and implemented 6 months earlier. She explained it with the confidence of someone who had conceived the idea herself, using the exact terminology and technical specifications I had shared with her during one of our training sessions. Every word, every pause, every technical detail, it was my work being presented as her innovation. When Mr. Harrison, our regional manager, complimented her on her creative problem-solving approach, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I waited for her to acknowledge my contribution, to mention that we had worked on it together, or at least to give me some credit for the original concept. Instead, she simply smiled and accepted the praise as if it belonged entirely to her. The most painful part wasn't just the theft of my work, it was watching her deliver my ideas with such practiced ease that I began to question whether she had been planning this moment all along. The interruption happened during what should have been my moment to shine. I was explaining our new authentication protocol to Director Williams, detailing the security measures I had implemented to protect our client data. I was mid-sentence, explaining the encryption algorithms I'd selected, when Rebecca smoothly cut in with, "I think what's important here is that we move forward with implementation." Her tone was polite but dismissive, as if my technical explanation was unnecessary detail that was boring our director. Williams nodded and turned his attention to her, effectively ending my contribution to the conversation. I sat there, feeling invisible, as she took over the discussion and began outlining next steps for a project that I had single-handedly designed and developed. The casual way she dismissed my expertise, reducing months of my work to irrelevant background noise, was like a slap in the face delivered with a smile. Later, when I tried to finish explaining the technical aspects to Williams after the meeting, he brushed me off with, "Rebecca seems to have it well in hand." The access request should have been my second major red flag, but I was still operating under the assumption that Rebecca was genuinely trying to learn rather than systematically replacing me. "I was wondering if I could get access to your testing environment," she said one Thursday afternoon, perching on the edge of my desk with that same nervous smile she'd worn on her first day. "I think it would help me understand the system better if I could run some experiments on my own." Her request seemed reasonable. After all, hands-on learning was often more effective than theoretical explanation. I walked her through the access protocols and gave her the credentials she needed, explaining the different testing scenarios I had set up and how to navigate the various environments safely. She listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about backup procedures and rollback protocols. What I didn't realize was that she was conducting her own private audit of my work, documenting my processes and solutions so she could eventually present them as her own discoveries. From that point forward, Rebecca's requests for help evaporated completely. The woman who had once needed guidance on the most basic tasks was suddenly navigating complex system integrations without breaking a stride. She began staying late not to practice what I taught her, but to work independently on projects I wasn't even aware existed. I'd see her in deep conversation with senior managers, discussing technical strategies and implementation timelines with a confidence that seemed to have appeared overnight. When I tried to join these conversations or offer my input based on my experience with similar projects, she'd acknowledge me with a polite nod and then redirect the discussion back to her own ideas. It was like watching someone wear a mask of competence that had been carefully crafted from pieces of my own expertise. The most unsettling part was how natural she made it look, as if she had always possessed the knowledge she had systematically extracted from me over the previous months. The transformation was complete when I realized that Rebecca had begun walking the halls with the kind of confidence that comes from being seen as indispensable. She carried herself differently, spoke with more authority, and somehow always seemed to be in the right place, at the right time when important decisions were being made. She joined the inner circle of senior staff members who gathered around the coffee machine each morning to discuss strategy and priorities. When I approached these informal meetings, the conversation would subtly shift or wean down, leaving me feeling like an outsider in my own workplace. The woman I had mentored, guided, and supported was now operating in spaces that had once been accessible to me, using knowledge I had given her to secure a position I had helped her attain. But the most painful realization was yet to come. I was about to discover that her rise wasn't just built on borrowed expertise, but on actively undermining the person who had made it all possible. The meeting invitation appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning with no context, just a simple subject line that read, "Performance discussion," and a calendar slot for 3 o'clock that afternoon. I assumed it was routine feedback, or perhaps a discussion about new project assignments. Maybe even a conversation about the promotion I'd been hoping for, after 3 years of dedicated service. I spent the morning reviewing my recent accomplishments, mentally preparing to discuss the successful system integrations I'd completed and the cost savings I'd generated for the company. When I walked into David's office that afternoon, I was expecting encouragement, recognition, or at worst, constructive criticism about areas where I could improve. Instead, I found myself facing a blindside that would fundamentally alter how I viewed trust, loyalty, and professional relationships. The fluorescent light seemed harsher than usual, and David's expression was unreadable as he gestured for me to take a seat across from his desk. The words hit me like a physical blow, delivered with the clinical detachment of someone reading from a script. "Rebecca has expressed some concerns about your technical capabilities," David said, not quite meeting my eyes as he spoke. "She mentioned that you seem to struggle with logical system architecture, and that your approach to problem-solving might be holding the team back." I felt the blood drain from my face as I processed what he was saying. This was the same Rebecca who had spent weeks asking me to explain basic file structures, who had needed my help to understand the most fundamental aspects of our systems. The same person who had called my notebook gold and claimed she didn't know what she'd do without my guidance was now questioning my technical competence to our manager. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How do you defend yourself against accusations made by someone you trusted, using knowledge you gave them as evidence of your own inadequacy? David continued with a phrase that burned itself into my memory, words I knew I would replay over and over in the sleepless nights that followed. "We need someone more technical in a leadership capacity," he said, shuffling through papers on his desk, as if he was discussing something as mundane as office supplies rather than dismantling my career. More technical? I was the person who had single-handedly resolved our integration crisis 6 months earlier, who had developed the authentication protocols that were now industry standard within our company, who had trained half the department on systems I had personally designed and implemented. The irony was suffocating. I was being judged as insufficiently technical by the person I had personally educated about every technical aspect of our operation. But there it was, delivered with corporate politeness and couched in language about team dynamics and evolving needs. The verdict that my expertise was somehow inadequate for the role I had been performing successfully for years. The documentation was what made the betrayal feel premeditated rather than spontaneous. David pulled out a formal written assessment that Rebecca had submitted to Human Resources, typed on company letterhead with official formatting that suggested careful preparation rather than casual feedback. As he read excerpts aloud, I recognized my own technical explanations twisted into evidence of confusion, my patient teaching methods reframed as signs of uncertainty, and my collaborative approach presented as lack of decisive leadership. "She notes here that you frequently need to reference documentation for basic procedures," he read, apparently unaware that the documentation he was referring to was the comprehensive system guide I had created myself. The assessment suggested I needed recyclagem and estructuras mais modernas, refresher training on modern frameworks that I had personally researched, evaluated, and recommended for implementation. Every criticism was a distorted reflection of my own expertise, weaponized against me by someone who had learned everything she knew about those systems from sitting beside my desk and copying my notes. The most devastating part wasn't the content of the criticism, but the realization of how thoroughly I had been studied and catalogued. Rebecca hadn't just been learning from me, she had been building a case against me, documenting every moment when I had to think through a problem or reference my own notes as evidence of incompetence rather than thoroughness. The assessment painted a picture of someone uncertain and outdated, struggling to keep up with modern technical demands, when the reality was that I was the person who had brought most of those modern technical solutions to our company in the first place. Reading those words felt like watching someone use my own tools to dismantle everything I had built. She had taken my knowledge, my patience, my willingness to teach and collaborate, and transformed it all into a narrative about my professional inadequacy. The betrayal was so complete, so systematically constructed, that I found myself almost admiring its thoroughness, even as it destroyed me. As David concluded the meeting by explaining that they would be restructuring the team to better align with current technical demands, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The naive part of my personality that had trusted easily and shared freely was dying in real time, replaced by a cold understanding of how corporate loyalty actually works. Rebecca hadn't just taken my job. She had taken my belief in the goodness of professional relationships, my faith that hard work and collaboration would be recognized and rewarded. The woman I had mentored was not just my replacement. She was my professional executioner, and she had used my own kindness as the weapon. I nodded politely as David outlined the transition timeline, but inside I was calculating how many months of knowledge transfer I had provided to my own successor, how many late nights I had spent training the person who would ultimately use that training to justify my removal. Walking back to my desk after that meeting, I felt like I was moving through water, everything slightly surreal and distant. My co-workers continued their normal routines, typing at keyboards, answering phones, discussing weekend plans, completely unaware that the person they had worked alongside for 3 years had just been professionally executed by someone they probably saw as a rising star. I sat down at my workstation and stared at my computer screen, seeing my reflection in the black monitor like I was looking at a stranger. The technical documentation I had written, the system improvements I had implemented, the cost-saving solutions I had developed, all of it would remain, but now attributed to someone else's leadership and vision. Rebecca had not just stolen my position. She had stolen my professional identity and convinced our management that she was the original creator of innovations that had literally come from my mind and my hands. The betrayal was so thorough that I almost wondered if I had imagined my own contributions, if perhaps I really was as technically inadequate as her assessment suggested. The shift in team dynamics didn't happen overnight, but once it began, it spread through our department, like a slow-moving infection that gradually poisoned every professional interaction I had valued. It started with subtle changes in body language during meetings, the way people would turn slightly toward Rebecca when technical questions arose, or how conversations would naturally flow in her direction, even when I was the one with the relevant experience. What had once been my domain of expertise was slowly becoming hers in the collective consciousness of our colleagues, and I found myself watching this transformation with the helpless fascination of someone witnessing their own professional funeral. The most painful part was realizing that my coworkers weren't intentionally cruel. They were simply following the new social hierarchy that Rebecca had carefully constructed through months of strategic positioning and subtle undermining. I was becoming invisible in plain sight, a living ghost haunting my own workplace. The morning daily stand-up meetings became exercises in humiliation, disguised as routine business discussions. These 15-minute sessions had always been collaborative affairs where team members shared updates, discussed challenges, and coordinated efforts for the day ahead. But something fundamental had changed in the weeks following my performance review. As we gathered around the conference table with our coffee cups and notepads, I noticed that questions were directed toward Rebecca, even when they concerned projects I had initiated or systems I had designed. When I tried to contribute information about ongoing technical issues, my comments were acknowledged with polite nods, but never developed into meaningful discussion. It was as if my voice had become background noise, present but not particularly relevant to the important decisions being made. Rebecca would listen to my input with that same patient expression she had worn when I was teaching her, then seamlessly redirect the conversation toward her own insights and recommendations. The nickname reached my ears during what should have been a casual conversation between colleagues near the printer. I was walking past when I heard Jake from accounting refer to me as Professor Pardle, followed by laughter that was clearly at my expense rather than with it. The reference stung more than I expected. Professor Pardle was the absent-minded inventor from Disney cartoons. Brilliant but impractical. Someone whose ideas were more theoretical than useful. When I turned around, Rebecca was part of the group, and she laughed along with the others, before catching my eye and offering what appeared to be an apologetic smile. "Oh, we're just being silly," she said, but there was something in her expression that suggested the nickname wasn't as innocent as she was pretending. The joke felt pointed and deliberate, designed to diminish my credibility by framing my expertise as academic rather than practical, outdated rather than foundational. It was the kind of subtle character assassination that Rebecca had become expert at delivering. The project presentation theft was the moment I realized how completely I had been erased from my own professional narrative. I had spent 3 months developing a comprehensive overhaul of our client management system, working through integration challenges and designing user interfaces that would streamline operations across multiple departments. The presentation to senior management was supposed to be my opportunity to showcase this work and demonstrate the value I brought to the organization. Instead, I watched from the back of the conference room as Rebecca took the podium with slides that contained my research, my solutions, and my recommendations, all presented under her name and leadership. She acknowledged my contribution with a single sentence. "I want to thank Sarah for her assistance with some of the background research, reducing months of my work to the level of clerical support." The worst part was how naturally she delivered my ideas, as if they had originated in her mind, rather than being carefully extracted from mine through months of mentorship sessions. The social isolation became most apparent during lunch breaks in our building's small cafeteria. For 3 years, I had been part of the informal group that gathered around the corner table to discuss everything from weekend plans to workplace gossip to technical challenges we were facing. These conversations had been the social foundation of my work life, the place where I felt most connected to my colleagues as human beings, rather than just professional contacts. But gradually, I found myself sitting at the edge of conversations that seemed to naturally center around Rebecca, listening to discussions where my input was politely received but never built upon or developed. When I shared stories or offered opinions, there would be brief acknowledgements before the conversation moved on to more interesting topics. It was like being slowly edited out of the social fabric of my own workplace, becoming a peripheral character in conversations where I had once been a central voice. The technical discussions that had once sought my input began bypassing me entirely, with colleagues approaching Rebecca directly for guidance on systems I had designed and implemented. I would overhear conversations at neighboring desks where junior developers asked her about database structures I had created, or watch as she confidently explained troubleshooting procedures that I had developed through months of trial and error. The most surreal moments came when I would listen to her teaching others using the exact phrases and explanations I had used when training her, delivered with the authority of someone who had discovered these solutions independently. When I tried to join these impromptu training sessions or offer additional context based on my experience, Rebecca would politely acknowledge my presence while subtly maintaining control of the conversation, ensuring that I remained a supporting character in discussions about my own work. The final confirmation of my professional exile came during a team-building lunch at Applebee's, where I found myself sitting at one end of a long table while animated conversations swirled around Rebecca at the other end. She was discussing future projects and strategic initiatives with the kind of enthusiasm and authority that had once characterized my own interactions with the team. I ate my chicken salad in relative silence, occasionally contributing to conversations that felt increasingly forced and uncomfortable. When dessert arrived and people began sharing stories about their career aspirations and professional goals, Rebecca spoke passionately about her vision for modernizing our technical infrastructure, a vision that was built entirely on foundations I had laid, but which she presented as her own innovative thinking. As I listened to my colleagues respond with genuine excitement and admiration for her leadership, I realized that I had not just lost my position within the company. I had lost my professional identity entirely. The person I had been at Patterson Tech no longer existed in the minds of my coworkers, replaced by someone else who wore my expertise like a costume, while I sat invisible at the same table where I had once belonged. The email arrived at 4:37 on a Friday afternoon, delivered with the kind of corporate sterility that makes devastating news feel like routine business correspondence. The subject line read, "Meeting request, Monday 9 a.m., with no additional context. No hint that this would be the message that officially ended my 3-year tenure at Patterson Tech. I was finishing up a system diagnostic when the notification popped up on my screen, and I clicked on it expecting to see details about a project review, or perhaps a discussion about quarterly goals. Instead, I found a brief message from David requesting my presence in the HR conference room first thing Monday morning, with Linda from Human Resources copied on the email. The tone was professional but oddly formal, lacking the casual friendliness that usually characterized internal communications. Something cold settled in my stomach as I read it, an instinctive recognition that this wasn't going to be a routine meeting, though I couldn't yet comprehend how thoroughly my professional world was about to collapse. Monday morning arrived with the kind of grey overcast sky that seemed to mirror my growing sense of unease about the unexpected meeting. I dressed carefully, choosing my navy blazer and the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me, as if professional appearance could somehow protect me from whatever was coming. The weekend had been filled with an anxiety I couldn't quite name, a persistent worry that something significant was shifting beneath the surface of my work life. As I walked through the familiar hallways of Patterson Tech that Monday morning, everything seemed slightly surreal, like I was seeing my workplace through a lens that made ordinary details appear strange and foreign. The conference room was located in a part of the building I rarely visited, down a corridor lined with motivational posters about teamwork and innovation that suddenly felt like cruel jokes about corporate values that had never actually existed. Linda from HR was already seated at the polished conference table when I arrived, along with David and someone I didn't recognize who introduced himself as a representative from the legal department. The presence of legal counsel should have been my first clear indication that this wasn't a routine performance discussion, but I was still operating under the assumption that rational explanations existed for everything that was happening. They offered me coffee, which I declined, and made small talk about the weather while we waited for someone else to join us. When Rebecca walked through the door 5 minutes later, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression of professional concern, I finally understood that I was walking into an execution rather than a meeting. She took a seat across from me at the table, and for just a moment our eyes met. There was something in her gaze that might have been regret or perhaps satisfaction, but it disappeared so quickly that I wondered if I had imagined it entirely. Determination was delivered with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this conversation had been rehearsed multiple times before. I arrived. "We've made the difficult decision to restructure your position," Linda began, reading from prepared notes while avoiding direct eye contact. "After careful consideration and evaluation of our technical needs, we've decided to move forward with a different profile for this role." The words felt abstract and meaningless, corporate jargon designed to obscure the human impact of what was happening. They spoke about evolving market demands and strategic realignment, while I sat there trying to process the reality that my employment was ending based on an assessment that portrayed me as inadequate for performing work I had been doing successfully for years. Rebecca remained silent throughout most of the presentation, occasionally nodding when specific technical requirements were mentioned, playing the role of concerned colleague rather than the architect of my professional destruction. The justification they provided was a masterclass in rewriting history to serve a predetermined conclusion. According to the official explanation, the team needed someone with expertise in emerging technologies and modern system architecture, someone who could lead innovative solutions rather than maintaining legacy systems. As they spoke, I mentally catalogued the emerging technologies I had researched and implemented, the modern architecture I had designed, and the innovative solutions I had developed that were now apparently insufficient evidence of my capabilities. The cruel irony was that Rebecca's supposed expertise in these areas had been acquired directly from me through months of patient instruction and knowledge sharing. Every qualification they cited as necessary for the role was something I possessed and had demonstrated repeatedly, but somehow my own accomplishments had been reframed as inadequacies, while Rebecca's borrowed knowledge was presented as innovative leadership. The transition timeline they outlined made it clear that my replacement had been planned well in advance of this meeting. Rebecca would assume my responsibilities immediately, with a brief overlap period to ensure continuity of operations. They had already prepared documentation transferring my access credentials and project ownership to her, suggesting that this decision had been finalized days or perhaps weeks earlier. The casual efficiency with which they dismantled my professional existence was almost as painful as the betrayal itself. I was given 2 weeks to complete knowledge transfer and tie up loose ends, which felt like being asked to participate in my own professional funeral. The most surreal aspect was how they presented this as an opportunity for me to contribute to a smooth transition, as if helping my replacement succeed was some kind of gift I could offer rather than a final humiliation. As the meeting concluded and I gathered my things to leave the conference room, Rebecca approached me with what appeared to be genuine concern etched on her face. "I want you to know this wasn't personal," she said quietly, placing a hand briefly on my shoulder. "You're incredibly talented, and I'm sure you'll find something even better." Her words were meant to sound supportive, but they felt like salt in a wound that was still fresh and bleeding. The woman who had systematically undermined my credibility, stolen my innovations, and convinced management that I was inadequate for my own job was now offering me career advice and emotional support. I managed to nod politely and thank her for her concern, but inside I was marveling at the audacity of someone who could destroy your professional life and then comfort you about the destruction. The worst part was that some small part of me wanted to believe that her regret was genuine, that she hadn't intended for things to unfold this way, even though the evidence clearly suggested otherwise. The walk back to my desk felt like a funeral procession through a workplace that no longer belonged to me. Colleagues who had worked beside me for years continued their normal routines, unaware that the person they had shared coffee breaks and birthday celebrations with had just been professionally executed in a sterile conference room down the hall. I sat down at my workstation and stared at my computer screen, seeing 3 years of work and relationships reduced to a 2-week transition period and a severance package that calculated my professional worth in terms of salary, continuation rather than actual contribution. The systems I had built would continue running, the problems I had solved would remain solved, and the innovations I had developed would keep generating value for Patterson Tech, but my name would gradually disappear from the institutional memory, until it seemed like Rebecca had been responsible for everything all along. I opened my desk drawer and began the surreal process of sorting through personal items and professional materials, trying to separate what belonged to me from what belonged to the company that no longer wanted my services. The nights became my enemy in ways I had never experienced before, stretching endlessly through hours of restless tossing and mental replay that left me exhausted but unable to find peace. Sleep, when it came at all, was fitful and broken by dreams where I was still at Patterson Tech, still explaining system architecture to Rebecca, still believing that mentorship and collaboration mattered in the corporate world. I would wake at 3 or 4 in the morning with my heart racing, temporarily confused about where I was and why I wasn't getting ready for work, before the devastating reality would crash over me again like a cold wave. The silence in my apartment felt oppressive during those dark hours, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from the highway. I found myself analyzing every conversation I'd had with Rebecca, every moment when I could have recognized the signs of her calculated betrayal, torturing myself with questions about whether I had been naive or simply human in my desire to help a colleague succeed. The endless replay of memories became a form of psychological torture that I couldn't seem to escape, no matter how hard I tried to focus on moving forward. I would find myself remembering specific moments with painful clarity, The way Rebecca had looked when I handed her my notebook, the tone of her voice when she called me her anchor, the expression on her face during that final meeting in the HR conference room. Each memory felt like picking at a wound that refused to heal, and I began to understand why people describe betrayal as a form of grief. I was mourning the loss of my professional identity, my faith in human decency, and my belief that hard work and loyalty would be recognized and rewarded. The woman I had been before all this happened felt like a stranger to me now, someone whose trusting nature and generous spirit seemed foolish in retrospect. I spent hours trying to identify the exact moment when I should have seen through Rebecca's facade, as if finding that moment could somehow undo the damage or prevent future betrayals. LinkedIn became a source of masochistic fascination that I knew was unhealthy, but couldn't resist checking obsessively. 3 weeks after my termination, Rebecca posted an update celebrating her promotion to senior systems analyst, accompanied by a professional headshot and a caption about "grateful for the opportunity to lead innovative technical solutions." The post had dozens of likes and congratulatory comments from colleagues who had no idea how she had actually achieved this position. She wrote about her excitement for bringing fresh perspectives to legacy challenges, and her commitment to modernizing our technical infrastructure for the digital age. Language that felt like she was describing my own work while taking credit for the vision and execution. Reading her words felt like watching someone wear my professional identity as a costume, and I found myself screenshot the post before I could stop myself, as if I needed evidence of how thoroughly my contributions had been erased and reassigned. The validation came from an unexpected source when my former colleague Nathan reached out through a private message that appeared in my inbox like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in self-doubt. "I know what really happened with Rebecca," he wrote, "and I wanted you to know that several of us are aware of how unfairly you were treated. She might have fooled management, but those of us who actually work with the systems know whose fingerprints are on the real innovations." His message continued with details about how Rebecca had been struggling with basic tasks that I had made look effortless, and how she frequently referenced documentation and previous implementations when asked to explain her technical decisions. Nathan mentioned that other team members had noticed the discrepancies, but felt powerless to speak up in an environment where Rebecca clearly had management support. Reading his message brought tears of relief and anger in equal measure. Relief that I wasn't losing my mind, and anger that the truth was obvious to those who mattered least in the corporate hierarchy. The decision to return to school felt like both an act of defiance and a path toward healing. Though I kept my enrollment in the Advanced Systems Architecture program completely private for the first few months, I found myself sitting in lecture halls 30 miles from my old office, surrounded by younger students who were hungry for the kind of knowledge I had been sharing freely just months earlier. The coursework covered emerging technologies and industry trends that I was already familiar with, but immersing myself in academic study provided a sense of purpose and forward momentum that had been missing since my termination. I attacked my assignments with the intensity of someone trying to prove a point to invisible critics, earning perfect scores on projects that demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking that Patterson Tech had claimed I lacked. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was expanding my expertise in the very areas where Rebecca had questioned my competence. But this education was for me, rather than for some future employer who might not appreciate what I brought to the table. The healing process was slower and more complex than I had anticipated, involving not just the practical aspects of finding new employment, but the deeper work of rebuilding my sense of professional worth and personal trust. I began seeing a career counselor who specialized in workplace trauma, though I was initially hesitant to frame my experience in such dramatic terms. Through our conversations, I began to understand that what had happened to me was a form of professional gaslighting, where my reality had been systematically distorted until I questioned my own competence and contributions. Learning to separate Rebecca's calculated betrayal from any deficiency on my part became a crucial part of moving forward, though the process was neither linear nor easy. Some days I felt strong and confident about my abilities, while others brought waves of self-doubt and anger that left me feeling emotionally exhausted. The gradual rebuilding of my confidence happened in small, private victories that no one else could see or measure. I completed online certifications in areas where I wanted to strengthen my knowledge, not because I needed them for job applications, but because I wanted to reclaim my sense of expertise and curiosity. I began contributing to technical forums and open-source projects, sharing solutions and insights with a global community of developers who valued knowledge for its own sake, rather than as a tool for political advancement. These interactions reminded me of why I had fallen in love with technology in the first place: the satisfaction of solving complex problems, the joy of learning new approaches, and the collaborative spirit of people working together toward common goals. For the first time since leaving Patterson Tech, I began to feel like myself again. Not the diminished version that Rebecca and management had created, but the competent, innovative professional I had always been. The betrayal had taken away my job and shattered my trust, but it couldn't take away my actual abilities or my passion for the work itself. And slowly I began to understand that those things might be enough to build something new and better than what I had lost. The education that Rebecca provided me had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with human nature, though it took months of reflection before I could appreciate the brutal clarity of the lessons she had taught. I learned that not everyone who seeks your knowledge wants to see you succeed, and that some people view mentorship as a transaction, where they receive your expertise in exchange for nothing more than temporary gratitude and false friendship. The woman who had called me her anchor and claimed she didn't know what she would do without me had been studying me from the beginning, not to become like me, but to replace me entirely. This realization forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own naivety and the assumptions I had made about professional relationships. I had operated under the belief that sharing knowledge freely would create bonds of mutual respect and loyalty, when in reality I had been providing someone with the tools to dismantle my own career while she smiled and thanked me for the privilege. The most important boundary I established in my new professional life was around the sharing of institutional knowledge, particularly the kind of detailed, hard-won expertise that takes years to accumulate. I learned to distinguish between teaching someone to fish and giving them your entire tackle box along with a map to all the best fishing spots. In my next position at TechFlow Solutions, when junior developers approached me for guidance, I offered help willingly but kept certain proprietary insights to myself until I could assess their character and intentions. This wasn't about being selfish or withholding knowledge out of spite, but about protecting myself from future exploitation while still being a supportive colleague. I developed what I called graduated mentorship, sharing basic principles and general approaches freely, but reserving the most valuable shortcuts and specialized techniques for people who had proven themselves trustworthy over time. The naive generosity that had characterized my relationship with Rebecca was replaced by a more measured approach that balanced helpfulness with self-preservation. One of the most painful lessons involved learning to recognize the difference between genuine respect and manipulative flattery, a distinction that seems obvious in theory, but can be incredibly difficult to identify in real-time interactions. Rebecca had been masterful at making me feel valued and appreciated while simultaneously undermining my position, using praise as a weapon rather than recognition. I learned to pay attention to whether compliments were delivered publicly or only in private, whether recognition came with concrete support or just empty words, and whether someone's actions aligned with their expressed admiration. True professional respect manifests in advocacy, credit sharing, and public acknowledgement, not just whispered thanks in supply closets and coffee breaks. The colleagues who genuinely valued my contributions were willing to speak up in meetings, share credit openly, and defend my ideas when they were challenged, while those who were using me for their own advancement kept their appreciation carefully hidden from anyone who might matter. The validation that mattered most came from unexpected sources and taught me to value substance over politics in professional relationships. The handful of colleagues who reached out privately after my termination, the developers who continued to seek my advice even after I left Patterson Tech, and the industry contacts who knew my actual work rather than my corporate reputation, These were the people whose opinions carried real weight. Their quiet support meant more than any performance review or public recognition I had received during my tenure at Patterson Tech, because it was based on direct experience with my capabilities rather than corporate narratives about my value. I learned that the most meaningful professional relationships are often invisible to management, built on mutual respect and shared expertise, rather than office politics and strategic positioning. The people who truly matter in your career are those who judge you based on your work, rather than your position in the organizational hierarchy. The question of what I would do differently consumed me for months after leaving Patterson Tech, cycling through anger, regret, and eventually a kind of philosophical acceptance. In my darkest moments, I imagined scenarios where I could have been more guarded, more suspicious, more strategic in my approach to mentoring Rebecca. I fantasized about withholding key information, setting traps to test her loyalty, or documenting our interactions to protect myself from future betrayal. But ultimately, I realized that changing my fundamental approach to helping others would have meant becoming someone I didn't want to be, someone whose professional relationships were based on suspicion rather than collaboration. The tragedy wasn't that I had been too generous or too trusting, but that Rebecca had chosen to exploit those qualities rather than honor them. If I became calculating and withholding in response to her betrayal, she would have won something far more valuable than my job. She would have stolen my character along with my position. The hardest truth I had to accept was that loyalty and integrity, while personally valuable, don't guarantee professional protection in environments where politics matter more than performance. I had operated under the assumption that doing excellent work and treating people well would be enough to secure my position and advance my career. But Rebecca's success demonstrated that strategic relationship building and calculated self-promotion could be more powerful than actual competence. This realization forced me to develop a more sophisticated understanding of workplace dynamics, without abandoning the values that defined who I was as a professional. I learned to document my contributions more carefully, to communicate my achievements more effectively, and to build relationships with decision-makers, rather than assuming my work would speak for itself. The goal wasn't to become manipulative like Rebecca, but to protect myself from future manipulation by being more aware of the political dimensions of professional success. The peace I eventually found came from understanding that Rebecca's betrayal revealed her character, not mine, and that her temporary success was built on a foundation of stolen expertise that would eventually be exposed. People who advance through deception and exploitation rarely have the substance to sustain their positions long-term, and I took comfort in knowing that the skills she had borrowed from me would only carry her so far, before her fundamental limitations became apparent. My integrity remained intact, my expertise was still valuable, and my approach to professional relationships, while more cautious, was still fundamentally collaborative and generous. The betrayal had taught me important lessons about protecting myself, while preserving the qualities that made me effective and fulfilled in my work. I could sleep peacefully knowing that my success, when it came, would be built on my own merit rather than someone else's stolen knowledge. Rebecca had taken my job, but she couldn't take my character, my skills, or my capacity to build something better than what I had lost. And in the end, that distinction mattered more than any corporate title or performance review could ever measure. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced something similar, or if you want to learn more about protecting yourself in toxic workplace situations, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. There are more stories like this one, more lessons about workplace betrayal, office politics, and how to rebuild your career after someone tries to destroy it. Because the sad truth is, Rebecca Martinez exists in every office, every company, every industry, and the only way to protect yourself is to understand how people like her operate.